ونريد أن نمن على الذين استضعفوا في الأرض ونجعلهم الأئمة ونجعلهم الوارثون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Karibu mpenzi mtazamaji wa IBN TV Africa katika kipindi muhimu au kipindi maalum ambacho ni kipindi cha siku ya kimataifa ya Quds. Katika kipindi hiki utaweza kujua mambo mbalimbali ambayo yanajiri duniani, hususan Mashariki ya Kati nchini Palestina. Siku ya Quds ni siku ya sauti kwa wale ambao wanapinga dhulma dhidi ya wote ambao wanadhulumiwa. Hususan katika Quds, siku ya Quds imelenga zaidi kuwazungumzia wa Palestina, maana wao wamekuwa wananyanyaswa na kuonelewa na kudhulumiwa zaidi kuliko.
Ladies, gentlemen, assalamu alaikum, good morning. On behalf of the Palestine-Tanzania Solidarity Committee and its fellow organizing associations, it is my pleasure to welcome you all this morning to this Quds Day commemoration and a seminar in support of the Palestinian cause and in support of all oppressed and subjugated people from around the world. My name is Tesin Takim, and I shall be the moderator for this morning's seminar. Before we move into the seminar, a few of what we call housekeeping rules. The restrooms are located at the back on the right-hand side. With regards to mobile phones, we will request if everyone can please move them to silent so that they don't interfere with the presentations being made by our speakers, and also because they sometimes interfere with the wireless microphone system which we have. And in terms of the language of this seminar, we will be using English and Swahili interchangeably, so please feel free to speak in whichever language you are more comfortable in. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are here at the Karimjee Hall, which is a hall of monumental importance here in Tanzania. It is a venue very much steeped in history. This is where the first president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, late, was first sworn in post-independence. On these very seats where you are seated today, generations of MPs have come through, ministers, prime ministers, members of parliament have sat on the very seats where you are seated today. Some of you here are perhaps revisiting your old playgrounds by coming here today. From these seats is where Tanzania's foreign policy used to be created, circulated, broadcasted, including the support which Tanzania has had so firmly for the Palestinian cause. Now, while this seminar will be focusing on the plight of the Palestinian people and the situation in Palestine, there is a wider message being delivered from this seminar this morning. And it is really to do with the crucial role that us as human beings, Tanzania as a country, and all countries around the world need to play in supporting oppressed and subjugated people in various countries around the world, irrespective of geographical location, ethnicity, and religion. Before I proceed, please allow me to introduce briefly the table of speakers which you see in front of you. On the far end, we have Dr. Bernard Achiula, the Vice Chairman of the Palestine-Tanzania Solidarity Committee. Please can you welcome him with a round of applause. Next to him is Professor Abdul Sharif, Professor Emeritus of History from the University of Dar es Salaam. His Excellency Mehdi Agha Jafari, the Islamic Republic of Iran Ambassador. Our Chief Guest of Honor, Sheikh Al-Hadi Musa, who is also the Chairman of the Tanzania Peace Committee. His Excellency Hazem Shabat, the Palestinian ambassador to Tanzania, and Professor Isa Shivji, the director of the Nyerere Resource Center and the Tanzania Commission for Science and Technology. We may also be joined by one more speaker who may be joining us slightly later, Dr. Murtaza Alidina, a medical doctor and an Islamic scholar. Now, in researching this seminar, I took the liberty of going through various books of various faiths. I took a look at parts of the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran. I read some of the philosophies of Hinduism and Buddhism. And one thing came across very clearly, and that is none of these religions can claim any monopoly or exclusivity when it comes to the virtue of human rights. All of these religions, faith groups, philosophies of life, whatever we may call them, are united in proclaiming their support when it comes to issues of human rights. They all share the same message. Stand up in the face of injustice, side with the oppressed, and live a morally sound existence. And therefore, regardless of which faith group anybody belongs to, I even went so far back as to reading some of these works of ancient philosophy from the likes of Socrates and Plato, who lived in centuries before the arrival of Christianity as well. And even they were talking about living the moral life. And they were discussing issues of morality and what does it mean to live the good life. It should therefore go without saying that standing in the face of oppression is an inherently human trait, irrespective of faith. It is a human trait, whether a person is theist, atheist, or agnostic. So as we say, jambo la Palestina ni jambo la kibinadamu bila kujali dini. Ladies and gentlemen, for opening remarks and welcome notes, please welcome to the lectern the Vice Chairman of the Palestine-Tanzania Solidarity Committee, Dr. Bernard Achula.
Thank you very much. Asante sana. Asayidi Dwaif Sharafi Sheikh Al-Hadi Musa, Asayidi Safiri Filastini Harem Shabati, Saadati Safaraun Ayuh Al-Haful Karim, Assalamu alaikum. Bimunasabati Yaum Qudsi yasuruni an urahiba bikum fi hadha al-yawm al-azim Yaum al-Qudsi. Haidhu natadhakaru al-ma'asati alati yaishuha ihwanuna al-Filistiniyuna fi Filistini mundu sanata al-1967 ila yaumina hadha. Ni'abatan an Tanzaniyina aqulu bihana Tanzania sayakunu ma'akum laila wa naharan fil yusiri wal usiri ila yahumu fatihi. Bihadhi kalima al-muwajaza ashkurukum wa adiu lakum wa jamiu al-huduru Ramadan Karim wa shukran. Nitasema, I will say short in English. First, I thanked for all of you who came here to this important day, Qudsi. And then I said that we remember the difficulties and the torture that our brothers Palestinians suffer since 1967. And then I said on behalf of Tanzania, we say that we will not forget you and will support you until the day of your independence. We belong together, and as the vice chairman of the Tanzania-Palestine organization, we are determined to help our brothers and sisters of Palestine to see their bright day. Shukran Jazila.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for the welcome remarks. Like I mentioned, he's the vice chairman of the Palestine-Tanzania Solidarity Committee. And so perhaps if you want to learn more about that organization and the work that they do here in Tanzania, later on when we have a short break or after the event, maybe you can have discussions with him offline as well on how you can support his organization, which he is leading. One of the intellectuals from one of the universities in the USA, a very prominent supporter of the Palestinian cause, is a professor called Noam Chomsky. You will see him many times on the news. He has a lot of publications, journals, books, including books such as Manufacturing Consent and others, where he talks about how the media plays a role in shaping views on causes like Palestine. And he was one of the first intellectuals in the US to publicly associate the philosophy of Zionism with that of apartheid, which was seen in South Africa. And Tanzania, of course, was one of the strongest supporters of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa all the way to its independence, which is why many of you will remember that when Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa, his first foreign mission was to Tanzania. And I'm reminded of one of Nelson Mandela's sayings where he says, "We know too well that our freedom," as in the freedom of South Africans from apartheid, "we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians." And yes, South Africa was liberated, but Palestine still remains. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker will be discussing some of the historical issues related to Palestine and the legality of the occupying power. Please welcome Professor Emeritus of History, Professor Abdul Sharif.
But I want to talk about Palestine, and it is really not merely a history subject. It is a very human subject, as our coordinator has explained. And as you can see from the slide, I've deliberately mentioned Palestine, the most oppressed nation. And I really mean this, because looking through history, I've not come across any other nation that has been suppressed for so long that for 70 years, we are still talking about the same subject, and there doesn't seem to be an end to it. You also have the map of what Palestine is geographically. But I want to explain what is the origin of the Palestinian question. Very prominent Jewish historians, including people like Bernard Lewis, Mark Cohen, who are even Zionists to some extent, they admit that the Jews have never had a freer time to develop their culture except when they were under Muslim rule. The renaissance of the Jewish religion as well as culture really occurred in Andalusia, in Spain, under Muslim rule. And when the Muslims and the Jews were both driven out of Spain in the 15th century, the Jews took refuge where? In Muslim Ottoman Turkey. And there they were protected, and they remained for a long time. So there is no question here that there is antipathy between Muslims and Christians that leads to this conflict, because they've always benefited. And people like Bernard Lewis very openly admitted in their book. Now, so where does the Jewish problem comes about? Where does this problem arises? It arises from the oppression of Jews in Europe. That's the beginning of this conflict that we are talking about today. We've all heard of the Russian pogroms, the killings of Jews in Russia over several centuries, and they're called pogroms. Every few years, they will be killed, and they will be discriminated against, everything that you can talk about. And then, of course, we know about the Holocaust in Germany, when millions of Jews were killed. And that is also a fact. So this was the Jewish problem. We start with the Jewish problem there. And it was a Jewish problem not of the creation by Palestinians. They had no hand in creating that Jewish problem. It was a European problem. The Europeans failed to deal with the minority themselves. And instead of trying to solve that problem after the Holocaust, they decided to export it to Palestine. That's when the Jewish problem becomes a Palestinian problem. So I think we should bear in mind, when does it start? And it starts with what is called the Balfour Declaration. Now here, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 20th century, until the First World War. When Turkey was defeated in that war, all the territories, not only Turkey, but Germany and all the other colonial powers, their colonies were taken away and put under the League of Nations mandate system. And the mandate system, its primary principle was that these countries should be developed in the interest of the people of those territories. That was the fundamental principle. Like Tanganyika. Tanganyika was a colony of the Germans, and it became a trusteeship territory administered by the British. The same way as Palestine was a trusteeship territory administered also by the British. And yet, in 1917, the Prime Minister of Britain, called Balfour, issues a declaration. And he says, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home of the Jewish people, for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavor to facilitate the achievement of this objective. Now, what gave them the right under the United League of Nations for the British Prime Minister to promise a land which was not theirs to the Jews? If they wanted it, they could have taken them to England. But we should also remember that Palestine was not the only country that was being considered where to send the Jews, where to export the problem to. They considered Argentina. They even considered Uganda. And if they had accepted the Uganda solution, today, instead of having a Palestinian problem, we would have been probably discussing the Uganda problem. But even in that Balfour Declaration, Balfour mentioned it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, this was supposed to be their commitment, that they will not compromise the interests, the rights of the existing people. And the British failed to live up to their promise themselves. So that's where the Palestinian problem then is born. The British began to allow these refugees from Europe to come and live there. But if we provide, I've the figures there on the chart, that in 1850, in the land of Palestine, there were 350,000 people. Out of this, 96% were Arabs, both Christians and Muslims. And they had been living together at peace for generations, for centuries. But there were also 4% Jews who were living there in 1850. And even the Jews, they consider themselves as Palestinians, they call themselves Palestinians. They lived together at that time. When you come to 1948, because of this migration that the British had allowed, by that time, there were only 68% who were Arabs. And now 32%, one-third of the people in Palestine were Jews. This was the situation by 1948, because of the British allowing the Jews to settle there, and of course beginning to buy out and take over land. Of course, that led to a conflict. And the conflict went now to the United Nations, the successor to the League of Nations. And the United Nations, they developed a plan under a Swedish diplomat, which divided Palestine between the Arabs and the Jews. On one side, the Arabs include Christians and Muslims. The Arab state, which is, at that time, according to this plan, was supposed to include 1.2 million people. But they were allocated only 43% of the land. The Jewish state, according to this plan, included only 600,000 people, one-third, half of what the Arab population was. And yet, they were allocated 56%. So already you can see, even in the United Nations plan, there was already an imbalance that is beginning to appear there, partly, entirely, because of the powers, the big powers of the West supporting the Jewish or Israeli claims. And they created an international city of Jerusalem, which will include equal number of Jews and Arabs, of about 100,000 at that time, they had calculated. So already this plan was imbalanced against the interests of the Arabs. But obviously, this was not enough what the Jews wanted. They took the first opportunity in 1948. In the war, they grabbed 78% of the land for these 600,000 people. They took over 78% of the land and expelled 1 million Arabs to go and live in refugee camps. And many of those people are still living in those refugee camps 70 years later. Now, the next one, I have a map which you have seen a lot, showing how this original small Jewish population in 1947. In 1947, if you look at the map, there were only spots of settlements by Jews along the coast, the northern coast of Palestine, and in the northern part. But there was really isolated spots. In the partition plan, you can see that they had devised 3 areas where Arabs would form their state: the northern part, the Galilee, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. But the Gaza Strip was bigger than what it is now. After the war, in 1948, the Israelis took everything except a very narrow strip of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And since then, since 1967, when they occupied the whole of Palestine, they have proceeded to grab even more land from this West Bank and at one time even Gaza, establishing settlements. So now essentially you have Bantustans. And I think this word is very appropriate. These are Bantustans. You find isolated areas where the Arabs can do their thing. Otherwise, the Israelis were going to take everything else. One program that came, particularly after the 1967 war, was actually establishing Jewish settlements in the former West Bank and Gaza Strip, which was against all international laws. International laws are very, very clear that you cannot claim any territory through war. You cannot replace the local population. All of this, you can go through all the 10 international laws. All of them prohibit this. But the Israelis have consistently tried to occupy, establish settlements everywhere. So, for example, on the West Bank in 1972, 5 years after occupation, there were only 1,200 settlers. By 2009, there were 300,000 settlers. In Gaza also, there were 7,000. By 2004, there were 7,800. Taken as a whole, the whole of, including the Golan Heights, which they also occupied, which is Syrian territory, they had 600,000 or so settlers living on land which was Arab according to the international law, according to the United Nations. And in the process, of course, destroying the houses which used to be occupied by the Palestinians. We have seen the posters around the town here showing that nearly 50,000 houses occupied by the Palestinians were destroyed by the Israelis. When the Palestinians began to resist, to fight for their rights, the Israelis found a solution: the apartheid wall. Now, this apartheid wall, if it had followed the 1967 border, you can say, fine, they're trying to protect their land against any invasion or so-called terrorism. Everything else is terrorism. What they do is not. But they don't follow. They build these walls specifically cutting through Palestinian territory in order to grab more land, so that when eventually, if they are forced to withdraw, they will still claim all the land to the west of the wall. This wall is 1,000 kilometers long, and it is 8 meters high. Now, we heard a lot in 1988 about the Berlin Wall. And even you remember President Reagan telling the Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, break down that wall. But let us look at the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was about this high, literally. It was about 8 feet, and it was only 200 kilometers long. But the whole world made a big noise about break that wall, and yet nobody is saying, break this Israel's new apartheid wall, which has reduced, as you can see from the map, literally the Palestinian land into Bantustans. And this is what they're supposed to be negotiating now. Now, I remembered, I mean, this has been going on, but I was reminded of Yasser Arafat going to the United Nations in 1974. And he gave a very powerful speech. And he stood there and he said, today I've come bearing an olive branch in one hand and a freedom fighter's gun in the other. Do not let this olive branch fall from my hand. And he repeated it twice. This was in 1974, which was 42 years before today. It is as long as the age of my son, who is sitting there. During those 48 years, he has grown up. He has a family of 2 children. And yet, there has been no progress in 42 years of negotiation to resolve the problem of Palestine. So, I think the question that really we have, and I would like to put it very starkly, this is my own public opinion, I don't represent necessarily the views, but I'm sure many of them would agree with me. I think we have to make a choice between negotiation and armed struggle. There has been no other solution. We have talked since the 1948 war, since the 56 war, since the 67 war, the 73 war, the Intifada 1, 2, 3 negotiation has been going on, the Oslo Agreement. There has been no progress at all. Absolutely no progress. We are further back than what we were in 1967 in terms of the rights of the Palestinians. Much further back. And we look at this, the picture that I have there of the President of America receiving, on the one hand, the Prime Minister of Israel, and on the other hand, Yasser Arafat. Bring them together after the Oslo Accord. And this was the Oslo Accord that was the excuse for people to say, okay, now the peace process is going on, so now we can relax. But what has happened since then? Within a short period, within 2 years, I think, of the Oslo Accord, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an extremist Jewish settler. The Prime Minister of Israel itself, who offered some hope of a solution, he was assassinated. And at the instigation of who? Of the current Prime Minister, Netanyahu. He was leading the campaign against Rabin. And Arafat, in 2004, he was poisoned and killed. And I don't hesitate at all to say he was poisoned by the Israeli Mossad. And at that time, there was a third person who was also struggling, who had chosen armed struggle to achieve some goal. This is Hamas under Ahmed Yassin. Ahmed Yassin was 67 years old. He was handicapped. He was in a wheelchair. He went to say his prayers in the morning, and he was killed. So it seems as if all avenues of resolution of this conflict have been systematically blocked to allow the Israelis to just continue to occupy everything. And the question is, why has the United Nations been asleep for 72 years or so? Why are the big powers silent all these years? Why are our nations collaborating with Israel? I think we should ask ourselves. We have to be honest. A lot of countries have recognized Israel, establishing embassies, and so on, in Africa as well. So, why has the world become so impotent on this question of Israel? Is it because of the 6 million Zionists in this world, which is a small, minute percentage of the whole population? Now it has been left to the Palestinian boys and girls who have been reduced through desperation to stabbing Israeli soldiers and settlers with penknives and scissors. And I would like, and this is, I see it as the third Intifada, and I would like to play, there is a clip there. Unfortunately, people sitting here will not be able to see it, but the rest of the audience will see it. Thank you very much.
And of course, that the slideshow which you saw at the end, if they say that a photo or a picture speaks 1,000 words, then I think that one spoke volumes and millions of them. I think one of the takeaway messages from the professors, first of all, I have to mention, I see there are some university students here, and you will know that to get a professor to stick to his time slot is very rare indeed. So thank you very much, Professor, for sticking to it. I think one of the main takeaway messages for me from that presentation was the fact that peace and freedom are not mutually exclusive entities. It is not that one comes at the expense of the other. I was reminded of one of the quotes from one of the civil rights movement leaders from the USA, known as, well, we refer to him now as Malcolm X, where he said, "You cannot separate peace from freedom, because no one can be at peace unless he has freedom." And that was part of the ethos of the civil rights movement, which he was spearheading, and I think that also lends itself quite well to the topic that we are discussing over here. Our next speaker this morning, to tell us straight from the ground on the current situation in Palestine and the situation of its people, please welcome to the lectern the Ambassador of Palestine to Tanzania, His Excellency Hazem Shabat.
Ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. Habari za asubuhi. I have the honor to stand before you today, humbled by the amount of solidarity and support that the majority of you have extended to Palestine for so many decades. It's not an easy task to address such an audience of supporters, and many of whom are experts on matters of international relations. I must also admit that it is becoming increasingly difficult to speak at such rallies, as the audience is so eager to listen and hear something new, something that would make their long contributions and efforts show some change on the ground. To accommodate this anticipation, I will refrain from elaborating on the history of the conflict, which I'm sure that Professor Abdul Sharif has covered extensively and very well. I couldn't have done it better. But I must say that I need to give a small brief on the developments that has been going on the ground and the new chapters of Israeli aggression against our people. It has become an established fact that since occupying Jerusalem in 1967, Israel has spared no effort in emptying the city of its inhabitants. Through enforcing discriminatory laws that deprive the Palestinian Jerusalemite his or her right of residency in the city for various reasons. Palestinians lose their Jerusalemite ID if they fail to apply for a leave and re-entry permit before they travel abroad, or if they apply for a resident visa in anywhere else in the world, or if they decide to reside outside the geographical boundaries of the city for more than 7 years. All these reasons give the occupation authorities the right to revoke the right of residency of the Palestinians in Jerusalem. And as a result, 80,000 Jerusalemites have lost this right of living in their home city. The occupation authorities have also made it almost impossible for a Palestinian to gain a permit for house construction in only 14% of the land designated for Palestinian housing in Jerusalem, while at the same time, 34% is allocated for settlers' housing. And with the increase of extremism in Israel and the assumption of the rightist leaders the power in Israel, we have seen a new wave of fanatic and extremist terrorism against our people in Jerusalem and the rest of occupied Palestine. The latest attacks on the Christian holy sites in the city at the beginning of this year are yet another proof of the radical and extremist rhetoric that is shaping and molding new generations of fanatic groups inside Israel. The latest acts of vandalism committed by the settlers against Christians and churches in Jerusalem further exposes the ugly and hateful face of the illegal settlers that the occupation army is trying to empower at the expense of centuries long of coexistence and harmony in the city. These campaigns against the Christian churches are nothing but another face of the coin of the daily aggressions committed against Al-Aqsa compound and the Muslim worshippers there. Israel is trying to create a new reality on the ground by the Jewish entry into and access to the Aqsa yards that is ongoing on almost daily basis. Under different pretexts, visiting, tourism, while in fact they are storming Al-Aqsa for conducting religious ceremonies under the protection of the Israeli occupation armed forces, who are suppressing any Palestinian attempt to protest by using lethal force. The attempts to divide Al-Aqsa compound into an Islamic and Jewish religious site has agitated the already volatile situation in Jerusalem, in Palestine, and even beyond in the Arab and Islamic world. And it proves that Israel has decided to change the nature of the conflict from a political cause to an ideological and a religious conflict. And we all know from history that this type of conflicts are almost impossible to resolve. But this is exactly what the Israeli leadership has decided and explicitly declared to do. So what is different? The situation has always been dramatic in occupied Palestine. I've been shouting for decades, but in vain. Things will never get better. All these expressions are, to an extent, legitimate, particularly if you have been a long-time supporter of Palestinian rights, let alone an activist or official or even a diplomat. But I assure you that the Palestinian confidence in attaining all our rights is only growing stronger, despite all brutal measures, oppression, military aggressions and bombings, and suffocating sieges against our people. We are confident because of the continuously increasing popular support of our people that has been breaking new grounds in every country around the globe. Solidarity movements are organizing themselves to protect Palestinian rights and to encourage all decision makers to uphold international law. The fact that we are gathered here today, where the overwhelming majority of the participants here have never been to Palestine, or the Middle East for that matter, proves that Palestine enjoys a type of solidarity that is so wide and so pure that no government or group of governments can suppress. This solidarity has empowered us to overcome the brutality of our occupiers. Our confidence is also derived from our people's resilience and steadfastness on their land, and the ingenuity of our new generations who formulate new means of resisting this unethical occupation. It is also derived from the solidarity extended by 137 states that recognize Palestine. We are also more confident in light of the diplomatic and legal victories achieved during the past few years that have made Palestine's legal status more detailed and undeniable. We have the support of the majority of the international community. Over 70% have voted in support of recognizing Palestine as a state that is non-member of the United Nations, a status that is similar to that of the Vatican, which, by the way, has recognized also Palestine as a state at the beginning of this year. We're confident because of our supporters, that the supporters of our rights are becoming more vocal and more effective. We have followed with great satisfaction and appreciation the advanced positions adopted by some governments and parliaments over the past years in support of the recognition of Palestine and its people's rights. We also followed how several peaceful movements like Boycott, Disinvestment, and Sanction Movement, BDS, has been able to reach every corner in the globe and exert pressure to expose the occupation of Palestine. People who enjoy this support are destined to succeed. On the political and diplomatic front, you may have followed during the past weeks the announced new efforts aiming at resuming the peace talks. And in this context, I wish to share with you these few observations. The Palestinian leadership has spared no effort since the declaration of independence in 1988 and even before to engage in any serious effort that aims at bringing an end to this occupation and restoring all inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. From Madrid to Oslo to Camp David to Taba to wherever to Annapolis, the Palestinian leadership has never and will never hesitate to explore the possibilities of reaching an end to the conflict and restoring all legitimate rights, as contained in the relevant International Security Council resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, and the Arab Peace Initiative. The Palestinian side has fulfilled all the commitments made under earlier agreements and understandings, such as the Mitchell Report, the Quartet Roadmap, and the many other understandings undertaken during the Oslo peace process. In this connection, we have encouraged the new initiative of France that is supported by the majority of the active relevant parties, as it constitutes an opportunity for the international community to exhibit its will in duly bringing this occupation to an end and pave the way for a just and comprehensive peace to prevail. In light of these diplomatic developments that Palestine, with the support of many nations, have collectively achieved, it is our understanding that any diplomatic discourse aimed at resuming the peace talks should only act as a vessel for adopting implementation mechanisms for ending the illegal occupation of the state of Palestine. Yesterday, we all read in the news about the shameful report of the Quartet Roadmap that has equalized between the occupier and the occupied in terms of responsibility of not advancing the peace process. And this only shows that the champions of Israel will do all they can to jeopardize the French initiative or any other initiative that aims to bring this conflict to an end, and also to bury the remaining values and principles that are enshrined in the UN Charter. Accordingly, we call upon all governments and peoples of the world to act in accordance with their legal and ethical obligations and embrace our people's aspiration for self-determination and peace. The occupation regime should be isolated and forced to yield to the will of the majority of peace-loving and law-abiding nations. In the same manner that the international community helped South African and many other nations in gaining their right from the apartheid regimes. Israel has to realize that occupying other people's land by force and violating their rights shall not be tolerated. Individuals, institutions, businesses, as well as governments are all encouraged to send a clear message of revoking all types of cooperation with the Israeli counterparts as long as the occupation of Palestine persists. This peaceful and legitimate tool of boycotting in-complying governments has been effective in many conflicts around the globe and should be also applicable in the case of Palestine, if international law and the values of human rights still hold any merit. Israel should not be an exception. Before ending, allow me to extend my appreciation to all partners involved in organizing this successful event. And I also wish to thank you participants for allocating the time despite the early hour, particularly for many of you who are observing the month of Ramadan. Thank you very much for your support.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for bringing us that news straight from the ground in Palestine. I think we are all very hopeful, and it's very heartening to see an increasing number of countries at the global platform at the United Nations increasingly recognizing Palestine as a state. I think that is a tremendous step forward and is a tremendous achievement for the government of Palestine. Palestinians clearly are very resilient people for all that they have been through. And if you want to discuss more or learn more directly with the Embassy of Palestine, they are located on the very aptly named Yasser Arafat Road out in Oyster Bay. And I'm sure they will welcome you wholeheartedly. Whenever Palestine looks for support, be it on the international stage or otherwise, come what may, they know that there is one country in this world that they can always count on. It is the Islamic Republic of Iran. The whole concept of the Quds Day, which we are holding this seminar on today, in fact, originates from Iran. And to tell us more about the significance of the designated International Day of Quds, please welcome the Islamic Republic of Iran's ambassador to Tanzania, His Excellency Mehdi Agha Jafari.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم و بهی نستعین فإنه خیر ناصر و معین. Guest of honor, Sheikh Al-Hadi Musa, distinguished guest of high panel, excellencies, ambassadors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My speech is in Persian, and the translator will translate it in Swahili. And at the end, I have a briefing in English, what I mentioned about the significance of the Quds Day. بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. بسیار خوشوقتم که در این سمینار به مناسبت روز جهانی قدس حضور دارم و از همه کسانی که برای برگزاری این سمینار مهم تلاش و همکاری کردند تشکر میکنم.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Nimefurahi sana kuwa pamoja nanyi katika semina hii yetu ya leo, na napenda kuwashukuru wale wote walioandaa semina hii muhimu.
روز قدس به عنوان مظهر فریاد مظلومان عالم و به عنوان پرچم آزادیخواهی ملت مظلوم فلسطین شناخته شده و در حقیقت تبلور اهمیت و جایگاه همبستگی و همنوایی امت اسلامی در تحقق یکی از اساسی ترین آرمان‌های جهان اسلام که همان آزادی قدس شریف است می باشد.
Siku ya Quds inatambulika kuwa ni kilele cha sauti ya wanyonge duniani, ni bendera ya wapiganaji uhuru wa dola ya Palestina na ni kielelezo cha umuhimu wa mshikamano wa umma wa Kiislamu katika kupatikana kwa jambo ambalo ni la msingi kabisa katika ulimwengu wa Kiislamu, nalo ni kukombolewa kwa Quds tukufu.
روز قدس تجلی وحدت و اتحاد اسلامی مسلمانان و همه آزادیخواهان جهان است.
Siku ya Quds inaonyesha umuhimu wa kuwepo kwa umoja wa Kiislamu pamoja na wapigania uhuru duniani.
پس از پیروزی انقلاب اسلامی ایران، امام خمینی رحمت الله علیه آخرین جمعه ماه رمضان را به عنوان روز جهانی قدس تعیین کردند تا مسئله فلسطین در اندیشه ها باقی بماند. ایشان روز جهانی قدس را برای زنده نگه داشتن قضیه فلسطین اعلام کردند و هر روز که می‌گذرد اهمیت این روز بیش از پیش برای ما روشن می شود.
Baada ya ushindi wa mapinduzi ya Kiislamu ya Iran, Imam Khomeini ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhi aliitangaza siku ya Ijumaa ya mwisho ya mwezi wa Ramadhani kuwa ni siku ya Quds duniani. Ili ni swala la Wapalestina liwe hai katika fikra za watu, na kila siku inayopita umuhimu wa siku ya Quds unaonekana zaidi kuliko mwanzo.
مهمانان گرامی، ملت فلسطین با وجود دردها و مشکلات خود به میهن و مقدسات و سرزمین و اصول خود پایبند بوده و پافشاری کرده است و به مقاومت خود ادامه داده و تسلیم نشده است.
Ndugu washiriki wa semina, wananchi wa Palestina pamoja na uwepo wa maumivu na matatizo mbalimbali bado wanalinda ardhi yao na heshima yao na misingi yao, na wamesimama imara na wanaendelea na mapambano na kamwe hawatarudi nyuma.
با وجود همه تلاش‌ها برای امحای قضیه فلسطین از افکار عمومی، این قضیه همچنان در افکار عمومی منطقه و جهان زنده است.
Pamoja na kuwepo kwa kila mbinu ya kuliviza swala la Palestina katika fikra za walio wengi, lakini tunaona bado swala la Palestina linabebwa na wengi kikanda na kimataifa.
ملت فلسطین در داخل و خارج سرزمین خود همچنان به سرزمین خود و مقدساتش فکر می‌کند و مخالف سازش با رژیم صهیونیستی است.
Wananchi wa Palestina waliopo ndani na nje ya ardhi ya Palestina wanailinda ardhi yao na heshima yao na wanapambana na utawala wa Kizayuni.
ملت‌های آزاده در سراسر جهان هر سال در روز جهانی قدس با برگزاری راهپیمایی و یا سمینار و گردهمایی همبستگی خود را با ملت مقاوم فلسطین اعلام می‌کنند و به آنها تأکید می‌کنند که همچنان در کنار مقاومت مردم فلسطین تا احقاق حقوق کامل و مشروع ایشان ایستاده‌اند.
Wapenda uhuru duniani kila inapofika siku ya Quds huandaa maadhimisho na kufanya matembezi ya amani na semina na mambo mbalimbali kuonyesha kuwaunga mkono mapambano ya Palestina na ukombozi wa watu wa Palestina hadi kuhakikisha kwamba haki yao kamili ya kisheria iweze kurejea.
ما نیز همانند سایر ملت‌های آزادیخواه جهان در تانزانیا و در دارالسلام در این برنامه حضور یافته ایم که تأکید کنیم ملت فلسطین تنها نیست و ما از مقاومت و مبارزه این ملت در برابر صهیونیست‌های اشغالگر حمایت می‌کنیم.
Sisi pia kama wengine wapenda amani duniani tumekusanyika hapa Tanzania katika mkoa wa Dar es Salaam kuonyesha kwamba hatutawaacha Wapalestina bali tutasimama nao katika mapambano dhidi ya uvamizi wa Kizayuni.
مهمانان محترم، در مقابل این اراده قوی و مقاومت قهرمانانه مردم فلسطین و حمایت‌های جهانی از قضیه فلسطین، سیاست آمریکا، رژیم صهیونیستی و استعمارگران این است که قضیه فلسطین به فراموشی سپرده شود و به یک قضیه عادی مبدل گردد.
Ndugu washiriki, pamoja na msimamo walionao wa Palestina katika kutetea ardhi yao, misimamo ya kimataifa juu ya swala la Palestina, lakini tunaona siasa za Marekani na utawala wa Kizayuni pamoja na wavamizi wote ni kutaka kuhakikisha kwamba wanalipoteza swala la Palestina na kulifanya kwamba ni swala la kawaida na ili lisiweze kupewa nguvu.
فشار به کشورها به خصوص کشورهایی که در خط مقدم حمایت از مردم فلسطین بوده‌اند برای عادی سازی روابط با اسرائیل یکی از ابزارها برای به فراموشی سپردن حقوق مردم فلسطین است. به این ترفند استعمارگران باید توجه جدی کرد. لکن این را بدانید صهیونیست ها در هر کجا حضور یافته‌اند جز مصیبت و ایجاد مشکل نتیجه ای نداشتند.
Vikwazo vinavyowekewa nchi mbalimbali ambazo ziko mstari wa mbele katika kuilinda Palestina na kuongezeka kwa mahusiano ya kidunia na Israel ni katika njia za kutaka kulimaliza swala la Palestina. Lakini hili lazima litambulike kwamba popote anapoingia Israel au kukaribishwa, wahusika wategemee zaidi matatizo na sio mafanikio.
اقدام دیگر استعمارگران برای به فراموشی سپردن قضیه فلسطین بحرانسازی در میان کشورهای مسلمان و به خصوص در منطقه خاورمیانه از طریق ایجاد گروه‌های تکفیری و تروریستی و مشغول ساختن کشورها به اختلافات و نیز جنگ‌های داخلی است که متاسفانه کشورهای اسلامی چند سالی است به آن مبتلا شده‌اند.
Njia nyingine inayotumika katika kulifisha swala la Palestina ni kuandaa na kuleta machafuko katika nchi za Kiislamu na hasa eneo la Mashariki ya Kati kwa kuunda makundi ya kigaidi na yenye misimamo mikali. Hivyo kuzishughulisha nchi za Kiislamu na nchi za eneo hilo kwa kutoelewana wenyewe kwa wenyewe na kutokea vita vya ndani, jambo ambalo na kwa bahati mbaya baadhi ya nchi nyingi sasa za Kiislamu zimekumbwa na tatizo hilo.
استعمارگران به زعم خود از یک سو با درگیر ساختن کشورهای اسلامی با یکدیگر و یا در داخل و از سوی دیگر با عادی جلوه دادن و حمایت از جنایات روزافزون رژیم صهیونیستی در سرزمین‌های اشغالی در این راه تلاش می‌کنند تا اذهان منطقه و جهان را از قضیه فلسطین منحرف کنند.
Kwa hali tunayoona ni kwamba wao wanatumia njia ya kuzigombanisha nchi za Kiislamu na kutetea jinai za utawala wa Kizayuni zinazoendelea katika ardhi walioivamia. Wanajaribu kubadili mitazamo na kuweka sura ambayo kimataifa itaonyesha kwamba swala la Palestina sio swala lenye umuhimu.
فلسفه روز جهانی قدس ایستادگی در برابر این عادی‌سازی‌ها و تأکید بر ضرورت احقاق حقوق مردم فلسطین است و اینکه تأکید کنیم ما حقوق غصب شده فلسطین و اشغالگری صهیونیست‌ها را فراموش نخواهیم کرد و از جامعه جهانی می‌خواهیم که اقدامات جدی برای پایان اشغالگری و احقاق حقوق مشروع مردم فلسطین را به عمل آورند.
Falsafa ya siku ya Quds ni kupambana na dhidi ya mambo haya tuliyoeleza, yani ya kudhoofisha mapambano ya Palestina na kusisitiza kwamba swala la Palestina la kudai haki yao ni swala la kimsingi na uvamizi lazima uishi na lazima jitihada za kimataifa ziendelee katika ukombozi wa Palestina na kumng'oa mvamizi.
مهمانان گرامی، اشغالگری، سیاست‌های توسعه طلبانه و تجاوزات و جنایت‌های رژیم صهیونیستی علیه مردم فلسطین همچنان تداوم دارد.
Ndugu washiriki, uvamizi na ukandamizaji na jinai za Kizayuni dhidi ya raia wa Palestina bado zinaendelea.
تلاش برنامه‌ریزی شده رژیم صهیونیستی برای یهودی سازی کامل قدس و نابودی هویت تاریخی و تمدنی قدس شریف، شهرک سازی، یورش به مسجد الاقصی و حتی که حرمت ساحت مقدس آن، محرومیت دسترسی فلسطینیان به اماکن مقدس و ممانعت از ورود نمازگزاران به این حرم وضعیت ناگوار و دردناکی را ایجاد کرده است.
Mchakato uliopangwa na utawala wa Kizayuni katika kuifanya Quds kuwa ni makazi ya Wayahudi na kufuta historia na utamaduni wa Quds tukufu na uvamizi wa Masjid al-Aqsa, kuzuia Wapalestina kufika katika maeneo matakatifu na kufanya ibada, kunawafanya Wapalestina waishi katika maisha ya tabu.
تداوم و توسعه شهرکسازی، کوچاندن اجباری ساکنان غیر یهودی فلسطین به ویژه بیت المقدس، اقدامات تجاوزکارانه علیه مناطق مختلف فلسطین، زیر پا گذاشتن بدیهی ترین اصول انسانی، کشتار کودکان، زنان و مردان بی‌دفاع، شکنجه زندانیان بیگناه، تحمیل محاصره ضد انسانی طولانی مدت و بسته شدن نقاط عبوری مرزی و گذرگاه‌ها، قطع ارسال مواد غذایی و دارویی، افزایش تعداد بازداشت شدگان و تعرض به مبارزان و ساکنان فلسطینی در این مناطق از جمله اقدامات ضد انسانی رژیم صهیونیستی است که همچنان علیه مردم مظلوم فلسطین اعمال می‌گردد و به ویژه باریکه غزه را در آستانه یک فاجعه عظیم انسانی قرار داده است.
Kupanua eneo la makazi ya Wayahudi, kuondoa wakazi wasio Wayahudi katika Baitul Muqaddas, kuvamia maeneo mbalimbali ya ardhi ya Palestina, kuvunja ubinadamu, kuua watoto na wanawake, kuua watu wazima wasiokuwa na hatia, kuadhibu wafungwa na mateka, kufungwa kwa mipaka, kuzuia misaada ya chakula na madawa ni miongoni mwa mambo yanayofanywa na utawala wa Kizayuni dhidi ya Wapalestina ambayo ni kinyume na ubinadamu. hasa katika ukanda wa Gaza ambapo hali ni tete sana.
تحرک جهانی در اعلام حمایت از ملت مظلوم فلسطین و بسیج ظرفیت‌ها و امکانات برای مقابله با جنایات رژیم صهیونیستی و ممانعت از فریب خوردگی برخی کشورهای اسلامی و عربی در تشویق این جنایت‌ها از طریق عادی‌سازی روابط با این رژیم از جمله مسائل مهمی است که ملت‌های مستقل و آزادیخواه جهان باید عمیقاً نسبت به آن هوشیار بوده و مانع از عملی شدن ابتکارات سیاسی بی‌معنا در جهت خدمت به منافع رژیم اشغالگر قدس گردند.
Harakati za kimataifa katika kuwalinda Wapalestina na kukabiliana na jinai za Wayahudi na umakini wa baadhi ya nchi za Kiislamu na za Kiarabu za kutoghilibika na mbinu za Mazayuni ni katika mambo muhimu ambayo kila mpenda amani anapaswa kuyaunga mkono, kwani ndiyo yatakayokuwa kikwazo dhidi ya sera za Kizayuni zinazolenga kuwanufaisha wao na kuzidisha ukandamizaji kwa wananchi wa Palestina.
حمایت از ملت فلسطین و گروه‌های مبارز فلسطینی در جهت همبستگی و ایستادگی یکپارچه در برابر رژیم صهیونیستی و افشای هویت و نیات نامشروع این رژیم و بهره برداری صهیونیست‌ها از جریانات تکفیری تروریستی به منظور برهم زدن امنیت کشورهای اسلامی و عربی از جمله موارد مهمی است که به ویژه در این روزها باید مورد توجه قرار گیرد.
Katika siku hizi muhimu lazima kuzingatia swala la kuwalinda Wapalestina na kupambana na uzayuni ulioanzisha makundi ya kigaidi kwa lengo la kuvunja amani katika nchi za Kiislamu.
مهمانان گرامی، به رغم همه تلاش‌های استعمارگران برای عادی‌سازی و فراموش کردن قضیه فلسطین، برگزاری این سمینارها و راهپیمایی‌ها و سایر برنامه‌های حمایتی و همبستگی با مردم فلسطین در روز قدس نشان می‌دهد که قضیه فلسطین همچنان در اولویت مردم مسلمان و نیز آزادیخواه و مستقل جهان و به خصوص مردم تانزانیا که به پیروی از رهبر استقلال تانزانیا مرحوم جولیوس نایرره همواره از حامیان اصلی مردم فلسطین بوده‌اند میباشد و این حمایت‌ها تا احقاق حقوق کامل مردم فلسطین و پایان اشغالگری ادامه خواهد یافت.
Semina hizi na maandamano na harakati zote zinazofanywa katika kuunga mkono mapambano ya Wapalestina inaonyesha umuhimu wa kuwaunga mkono wa Palestina pamoja na kuwapigania uhuru wote duniani, na hata Watanzania ambao kwa kuzingatia muongozo wa baba wa taifa Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere wamekuwa mstari wa mbele katika kuwakomboa Palestina hadi Palestina itakapokuwa huru.
یک بار دیگر جامعه جهانی را به برداشتن گام‌های عملی برای پایان دادن به اشغالگری و تحقق حقوق و خواسته‌های مشروع مردم فلسطین دعوت می‌کنیم.
Jumuiya za kimataifa pia ningependa kuziomba kuchukua hatua za kivitendo kuhakikisha uvamizi unamalizika na Wapalestina wanaishi huru kisheria katika nchi yao.
Just allow me to for just briefing in English in just a few words. Quds Day was initiated by Imam Khomeini in 1979, just a few months after the victory of Islamic Revolution in Iran in support of Palestine cause. This occasion is commemorating by the Muslims as well as all free and independent nations of the world on the last Friday of Ramadan every year. Naming this day shows the foresight of the founder of the Islamic Revolution to avoid forgetting the Palestinian cause and also solidarity with the Palestinian people and to insist that the Palestine issue trends to be a key issue in the region and across the world. The significance of this day is increasing every year, in particular due to the effort of Zionist regime and its supporters to forget the Palestinian issue and also Israel's effort to normalize relations with countries that are traditionally supporters of Palestine. Fortunately, the importance of this day is well understood by the people of Tanzania. Tanzanian people insist their commitment to the positions of their leaders, especially the great leaders of independence of Tanzania, the late Julius Nyerere. I would like to thank the people of Tanzania in this regard, and we wish success and prosperity to the state and people of Tanzania, as well as wish the liberation Palestine from Zionist occupation. And در پایان جا دارد از همه کسانی که در راهپیمایی روز گذشته در دارالسلام و نیز امروز در این سمینار شرکت کردید و همچنین برگزار کنندگان این دو برنامه صمیمانه تشکر و قدردانی نمایم.
Mwisho nawashukuru tena yote walioandaa semina hii na wale walioshiriki katika matembezi ya amani ya Quds jana.
برای همه شما آرزوی توفیق دارم.
Nawatakia mafanikio.
به امید پیروزی کامل مردم فلسطین در برابر اشغالگران صهیونیست و السلام علیکم و رحمت الله و برکاته.
Tukitumaini uhuru kamili wa Palestina utapatikana na uvamizi utatokomezwa. Wassalamu alaikum.
متشکرم.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for those words, and thank you also to the sister for translating from Farsi to Swahili. Now I have some of the history and the philosophy of the concept of Quds, and it has really become the bastion around which supporters of freedom around the world can actually rally around once a year. And you see that in processions, demonstrations, rallies throughout the world, actually. Yesterday there was one in Dar es Salaam, being the last Friday of the month of Ramadan. And you will see that these rallies take place throughout the world, not only in the Islamic world, but you will find these rallies take place in Amsterdam, in London, in New York, and other cities, major cities and smaller cities around the world. And you'll see some of the photographs in the photo exhibition, which is located outside. One of the interesting things, I think, which is coming out of the presentations we are hearing so far revolves around what we can call the violation of fundamental human rights. Now, there are actually, when we talk about violations, I took the liberty of going onto the United Nations website, and I found a document which is referred to as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is not the Islamic Declaration of Human Rights or the Palestinian Declaration of Human Rights. It is a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has been adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. It's a very interesting document, but I will read out just a few parts of it to give you a flavor of what this document, which has been passed by the General Assembly, actually entails. In the preamble, it talks about the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, being the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from fear, and freedom from want, has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people, the highest aspiration. And whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. This is from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed by the United Nations General Assembly. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, not certain human beings. It is not one rule for some and another rule for others. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article 3, everyone has a right to life, liberty, and security of person. And the last one I will mention, Article 5, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. These have been adopted on the global stage by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And despite that, listen to these presentations, which are coming straight from the ground. People who have researched deeply into these topics, and we will still hear a few more. And look at how they compare with the rules that we pass at a global level. We have next a slight break from presentations. We will be having a poem which has been composed by a student at the Institute of Imam Jafar Sadiq. It is a poem on the plight of Palestinians and the oppressed people of the world. Please welcome to the stage Mr. Hassani Amar.
Karibuni wanadamu, tutafakari tupange, kunusuru gurudumu la kutetea wanyonge, ni agizo la kudumu la Mola tusilipinge. Sote tunalo jukumu la kunusuru wanyonge, kila zamana sehemu twashuhudia mawenge, kutoka kwa madhalimu hukandamiza wanyonge, watu wapigwa mabomu, risasi, nyundo na singe. Sote tunalo jukumu la kunusuru wanyonge, tukikusanya damu ilomwagwa tuitenge, kwenye mji maalumu na kujengewa sengenge, kama ni Dar es Salaam, Ubungo yafika Mwenge. Sote tunalo jukumu la kunusuru wanyonge, na kurejea mwadilifu madhalimu tuwazonge, waache kuwadhulumu na kuwaua wanyonge, kama si kwako mwadilifu aende wapi mnyonge. Sote tunalo jukumu la kunusuru wanyonge, twawaonye madhalimu mkono tusiwaunge, mapadri na mashehe, mawaziri na wabunge, heshima ya mwanadamu hatimaye muijenge. Sote tunalo jukumu la kunusuru wanyonge, viongozi mlohumu muonevu tumpinge, kwa kila mwanadamu tumuite ajiunge, unyanyasaji ni sumu kuliko nyoka na nge. Sote tunalo jukumu la kunusuru wanyonge, tumuangushe dhalimu yeye na yake magenge, akiwa Yerusalemu na popote tumtenge, awe ana ukarimu vile vile tumtenge. Sote tunalo jukumu la kunusuru wanyonge, msichoke wadilifu kupigania wanyonge. Mola alotulazimu haki tuipiganie, huyo kalazimu tupiganie wanyonge. Sote tunalo jukumu la kunusuru wanyonge. Msichoke waadilifu kupigania wanyonge. Mola alotulazimu haki tuipiganie, huyo kalazimu tupiganie wanyonge. Sote tunalo jukumu la kunusuru wanyonge. Asante sana.
Thank you very much for the beautiful rendition of that poem. That poem was not only recited by the student of the Institute of Imam Jafar Sadiq, Hassani Amar. He not only recited it, but he also composed all of that himself. Let's give him another round, please. I think some of the words of that poem were actually quite poignant when you think about it. It reminds me of one of the quotes I read by an ancient Greek philosopher, Aristotle, where he says, "Virtue lies in our power, and similarly so does vice." Virtue and vice. Because where it is in our power to act, it is also in our power not to act. And so I think the message from that poem is, which side are you really on? Is it virtue or is it vice? We had planned a small health break, but in the interest of time, we are going to skip over that. And we will proceed with the other speakers who we have slated for this morning. Next, speaking to us on moral and spiritual obligations of the world communities in defense of the oppressed people around the globe, please welcome to the stage our chief guest and guest of honor, who is also the chairman of the Tanzania Peace Committee, Sheikh Al-Hadi Musa.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah Muhammad ibn Abdullah wa alihi wa ashabihi wa mawalah wa ba'd. Saad al-Safir, Jumhuriya Iraniya Islamiyya, al-Akhi Mahdi Aga Jafar, سعادة السفير فلسطين الأخي حزيم شبات، أبوي سعادة السفير الجزائر بيلا بيت، سعادة السفير أحمد بدوي، سفير الجزر القمر، سعادة السفير وكيوبا، mzee wangu Profesa Isa Shivji, Profesa Abdul Sharif, Dr. Bernard Achula, mama yetu Shamim Khan, mwenyekiti wa Jumuiya ya Wanawake wa Kiislamu Tanzania, mama yetu Zakia Megji, mzee wangu Dr. Alidina Murtadha Alidina, الحضور جميعا wote mliohudhuria. Kwa hakika jambo lililo mbele yetu ambalo tunalizungumzia hapa ni jambo kubwa kwa watu wanaojali utu na heshima ya mwanadamu. Tumemsikiliza Profesa Abdul Sharif ameeleza kwa mapana historia katika maeneo mbalimbali ya namna ya haki za watu mbalimbali zikikandamizwa katika ulimwengu na watu wenye nguvu kubwa kuwa ni watu ambao wasiojali wanyonge na haki zao mbalimbali. Leo tuko hapa tunaizungumzia Palestina. Wapalestina ni watu ambao wamenyang'anywa haki insania, wamenyang'anywa haki ya kibinadamu, wamenyang'anywa haki alhaya, haki ya kuishi katika nchi yao, wamenyang'anywa haki alhurriya, haki ya uhuru katika ardhi yao. Sisi kama wapenda haki duniani na kuona kila mmoja akiishi kwa amani, tuna wajibu mkubwa wa kuhakikisha kwamba Wapalestina wanaikomboa nchi yao na wanakuwa na haki kamili ya ubinadamu, haki ya kuishi na haki ya uhuru. Al-Imam al-Khomeini rahmatullahi alayhi alipoikhasisi hii يوم القدس alisema, akionyesha kwamba ili jambo la kuikomboa Quds ni jambo kubwa sana na ni jambo tukufu na ni jambo ambalo linatakiwa liwaenee watu wote ambao wanaopenda amani na utu wa mwanadamu. Alisema يوم القدس يوم عالمي لا يختص بالقدس فقط إنه يوم مواجهة المستضعفين للمستكبرين. Kwa siku ya Qudsi ni siku ya kimataifa, si siku ambayo inawahusu wa Palestina peke yao pale Quds. Ni siku ambayo wanyonge wanawaelekea wale ambao waliotakabari katika ardhi hii. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib radhiyallahu anhu wa karramallahu wajha alipata kusema, hina sakata ahlul haqqi 'anil batil dhannu ahlul batil annahum 'ala al-haqqi, kwamba watu wa haki waliponyamaza kuinyamazia batili, watu wa batili wakadhani kwamba wako katika haki. Kwa hiyo sisi kama watu wa haki tukiwanyamazia watu wa batil ambao wanakandamiza haki za watu wengine, wataendelea kudhani kwamba wanachofanya ni sahihi. Alhayatu fi nadhari alislam hibatun min Allah lilinsan fahiya haqqun lah. Uhai katika mtazamo wa Uislamu ni hiba inayotoka kwa Mwenyezi Mungu, amempa mwanadamu. Kwa hiyo ni haki yake mwanadamu. Mwenyezi Mungu Subhanahu wa Ta'ala asema, wa huwa alladhi ahyaakum thumma yumitukum thumma yuhyikum innal insana lakafur. Kwa hiyo uhai huu Mwenyezi Mungu amempa kila mmoja wetu na ana haki nao. ولذلك كان حفظ النفس أو حفظ الحياة من أسمى مقاصد الشريعة، وإن الإنسان نفسه مأمور ألا يعتدي على حياته ولا على حياة غيره. Na ndio maana kulinda uhai wa mtu, kulinda maisha ya mtu ni katika makusudio matukufu kabisa katika sheria ya Kiislamu. Na mwanadamu ameamrishwa yeye mwenyewe asiufanyie uadui hata uhai wake pamoja na uhai wa mwingine pia. Yani ule uhai wako wewe mwenyewe ni haramu kuutoa kudhuru nafsi yako wewe mwenyewe. يقول المولى سبحانه وتعالى ولا تقتلوا أنفسكم إن الله كان بكم رحيما. kwamba msijiue wenyewe, Mwenyezi Mungu kwenu hakuacha kuwa ni mwenye huruma. Ile wewe mwenyewe tukujidhuru mwenyewe ni haramu, na pia kumdhuru mwingine bila haki. Akasema wala taqtulu an-nafsa allati harrama Allahu illa bilhaqqi, kwamba msiue nafsi ambayo ameiharamisha Mwenyezi Mungu illa kwa haki. Idhan min madhahiri himayati alhayati alinsaniyya anna alquran alkarim i'tabar الاعتداء على حياة واحد من الناس تساوي بالاعتداء على الجموع الإنساني بكامله. kwamba Qur'an imezingatia kwamba kufanyia uadui uhai wa mtu mmoja ni sawa na kufanyia uadui uhai wa watu wote. Unapowanyima watu uhai ni sawa umewanyima watu wote. Qur'an inasema min ajli dhalik katabna ala bani Israil annahu man qatala nafsan bighayri nafsin aw fasadin fil ard fakannama qatala an-nasa jami'an wa man ahyaha fakannama ahya an-nasa jami'an. kwamba bani Israil auladu Yaqub, watoto wa Yaqub hawa, tuliwaandikia kwamba mwenye kuua mtu bila ya kuwa yeye kaua, mwenye kuua nafsi bila ya kuwa nafsi hiyo imeua, au akafanya ufisadi katika ardhi, ni kana kwamba ameua watu wote. Na mwenye kuwapa uhai watu au kumpa uhai mtu au nafsi yake ni kama vile amewapa uhai watu wote. Kwa hiyo utaona kwamba Mwenyezi Mungu Subhanahu wa Ta'ala uhai huu kila mmoja amempa haki ya kuwa nao na kufurahia maisha katika ulimwengu huu. Na dini zote al-adyanu samawiyya, dini zote zinazingatia haki za kuishi za kila mmoja. Idhan mambo ambayo yanayoendelea sasa Palestina ni mambo ambayo yasiyokubalika, ni mambo ambayo ni lazima dunia isimame, wapenda amani, wanaoheshimu utu wa mwanadamu wasimame ili kuona kwamba Palestina kama taifa liendelee kubaki kuwa ni taifa huru, wawe na haki zote wakienjoy maisha kama walivyo watu wa mataifa mengine. Sasa jambo hili kadri linavyoendelea kuzungumzwa katika sura kama hii, tumesikia kijana wetu mwanafunzi yule akilia juu ya dhulma ambayo inayoendelea ndani ya Palestina. Nimefurahi walillahi alhamdu, wakubwa wetu wako hapa, Profesa Abdul Sharif, Profesa Shivji na wasomi wengine wakiyazungumza haya ili nasi tupate uelewa wa kutosha juu ya dhulma ambayo inayoendelea Palestina. Na wao wana haki ya kufanya hivyo, na wakinyamaza watakuwa na dhima mbele ya Mwenyezi Mungu Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Maprofesa muendelee elimu hii ienee ili kila mmoja aone wazi ile dhulma ambayo inaendelea ndani ya Palestina. Kuna mtu mmoja aliniuliza hal fi Palestine jihad, hivi katika Palestina kuna jihadi? Wale ambao wanaokufa kwa kuhami ardhi yao, kuhami heshima yao, wana fungu gani mbele ya Mwenyezi Mungu Subhanahu wa Ta'ala? Nilimwambia naam, fi Palestine jihad wa fi Palestine shuhada, iko jihad, na wanaokufa wale kwa kutetea heshima zao na utu wao ni mashahidi, wanakufa mashahidi. Mtume sallallahu alayhi wasallam siku moja aliulizwa na mmoja kati ya masahaba zake, akasema, ya Rasulullah, ar-rajulu yatini yuridu mali, ewe mtume wa Mwenyezi Mungu, kuna mtu anakuja anataka mali yangu kwa nguvu. Qala la tu'tihi malak, mtume akamwambia usimpe mali yako. Qala fa in qatalani, qala qatilhu, yule mtu akauliza ikiwa atanipiga, mtume akamwambia nawe mpige. Qala fa in qataltuhu, qala fa huwa fi an-nar, yule mtu akauliza ikiwa nimemuua, mtume akasema atakwenda motoni uliyemuua. Qala fa in qatalani, qala fa anta shahid, mtume akasema, yule mtu akasema ikiwa ameniua mimi, mtume akamwambia wewe utakuwa umekufa shahidi. Sallu ala al-habib, sallu ala rasulillah. Fa in qatalak fa anta shahid, ikiwa amekuwa kwa ajili ya kutetea heshima yako na utu wako na damu yako na ardhi yako, wewe unakufa shahidi. Kwa hiyo Palestina wale ni shuhada kwa kulinda heshima na ardhi zao. Sasa jambo hili ni jambo ambalo tuendelee kulizungumza, walillahi alhamdu, kwa kiwango hiki na kwa kiwango kikubwa zaidi, ili watu wetu, si Waislamu tu, hata wa dini nyingine, hakuna ambaye anayependezwa na matendo ambayo yanaendelea ndani ya Palestina. Idhan nas'alullah al-karim, tunamuomba Mwenyezi Mungu Subhanahu wa Ta'ala an yu'izza al-islam wal muslimin wa an yudhilla ash-shirka wal mushrikin wa an yudhilla an-nifaqa wal munafiqin wa an yudhilla al-kufra wal kafirin bi'izzatihi wa qudratihi innahu ala kulli shay'in qadir wa bil ijabati jadir wallahu waliyyu at-tawfiq. Wassalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ahsan, thank you very much, Sheikh, for those words. We heard from Sheikh where he was talking about the verses of the Quran, talking about protecting life, standing up for justice, and fighting oppression, really in all of its forms. And in his closing, he referred to similar messages coming from various faith groups as well. And to help contextualize that, I will share with you something from the Old Testament, which I had found. It's interesting because the Old Testament is a book which is revered by both the Jewish community and the Christian community alike. And it's interesting that you find verses very similar to what Sheikh was quoting as coming from the Quran. And I think that says a lot about what different faith groups, both Abrahamic faiths and others, feel on issues of standing up for oppressed people of the world. There is the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament in chapter 10, verse 1, where it says, "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless," or the orphans. "What will you do on the day of reckoning when disaster comes from afar? To whom will you run for help? Where will you leave your riches?" So you find, regardless of which book you refer to, of which faith background you come from, even in faiths like Hinduism, there are concepts of dharma. Hinduism came 1,500 years before the arrival of Christ. And they talk about righteousness and the practice of spiritual and moral values. So you see, these values are overarching, regardless of what our backgrounds are, what our faiths are, where we come from, and what we do. We have two more speakers who will be hearing shortly, and after that, we will be opening the floor to comments, observations, and any input, interjections that you may have as members and participants of this seminar. But before we reach the open forum, I am pleased to invite to the lectern to talk to us about the total disregard by the Zionist state of the United Nations and its charters, as well as the role played by world countries in defending Palestinians and/or abandoning the people of Palestine. He is a doctor of medicine and an Islamic scholar. Please welcome Dr. Murtaza Ali Dina.